church? Hell no. Are you no longer feeling comfortable in church? This podcast is for individuals who are desperately missing God, but don't know how to find Him. Substance abuse, domestic violence, sex offenses, acrimonious divorce can contribute to discomfort in the church. For these individuals, church is just not an option anymore. Ordained minister Dennis Hall and his guests invite you to listen to this podcast for topics that are inspiring, uplifting, and will bring hope to those who just feel church is not relevant in their lives today.
I'm Dr. Dennis Hall, and we are delighted that you're listening to our podcast today. You know, there's always something that's on my mind to talk about, and it's funny how things trigger the topic for these podcasts. Recently, I learned of a brother and a sister that were suing each other over a property line. Now, this is the kind of thing, it's an example of how siblings become estranged. And they become estranged for a variety of reasons. You know, a recent YouGov survey found that 24% of American adults say that they are currently estranged from one of their siblings. Now, the most common reason for estrangement among siblings are lies, betrayal, manipulative behavior, and sometimes personality conflicts. Now, we, the world, have really gotten to watch, estrangement unwind right before our eyes over the last 10 years. You know, the world has watched the estrangement break out in England's royal family. Prince Harry gradually became estranged from his family as a result of years of tension and public disputes and a series of what could be considered pivotal moments that created a deep divide between him and King Charles III and his brother Prince William and other members of the royal family. This divide is so deep that King Charles no longer speaks to Harry. You see, even within the royal family, estrangement carries emotional weight. And as of 2026, right up to this time, you know, Harry remains publicly estranged from both his father and brother. And because the royal family no longer trusts Harry, and the fact that there's now a long history of public disputes, you know, observers say that reconciliation is highly unlikely and uncertain. You know, sibling estrangement is usually more painful than any other kind of family disconnection. Why? Because it involves, you know, long-standing and a deeply personal bond that is both unique and, in fact, irreplaceable. Siblings typically are the first and most enduring relationship in life. And it's a relationship that starts in childhood, and no matter what happens, it continues. This relationship continues into old age. Now, in normal relationships, you know, siblings enjoy a history filled with inside family jokes and knowledge about all kinds of things that went on in their family. And in these normal relationships, they often help each other manage emotions and navigate life's changes. So when the bond breaks, it's not just the loss of a person, it's the loss of a shared narrative and knowledge of your past and loss of a potential lifelong confidant. You know, sibling estrangement, it's not like the death of a family member. No, there's no funeral, no public acknowledgement, no formal grieving of any kind. Thus, for many, you know, there's this persistent low grade sorrow and anxiety that lingers throughout life. And, sibling estrangement sometimes damages a person's ability to trust others. And it leads to a preference for a few intense friendships, but superficial connections that is sort of a subconscious way to avoid further hurt. And yes, identity and self esteem can be affected. Psychologists tell us that estrangement can trigger what they call sibling transference. Sibling transference. It's when one's I should say, when one's unconscious childhood feelings toward a sibling resurface in adult relationships. Rupture of sibling relationships rarely happens suddenly. It usually develops over years of unresolved conflicts, differing values, and toxic family dynamics. The long duration and complexity makes the pain even more enduring and harder to process. Sibling estrangement is more painful than other types of estrangement because it literally strikes at the heart of who we are, our earliest and our most enduring relationships. The loss is personal, and for the most part, it's socially unrecognized, leaving a unique kind of grief that will shape us the rest of our lives. Psychologists and sociologists tell us that it's very common for the old roles in childhood to show up even as siblings become adults that have their own jobs and occupation and wives and partners. Well, when we're talking about sibling estrangement, you know, we're talking about a relationship that has resulted in having very little contact, or perhaps very guarded contact, or in many cases, no contact at all. This is it's a long term disconnection in many families. This means no phone calls, no text messages, and no visits. The family siblings might show up at a marriage or at a funeral or maybe even a holiday, and they'll smile and be cordial the whole time. But there's a tenseness. And when estrangement stretches across months and years, it simply becomes part of the family tradition, the family routine, the new routine. Distance and estrangement. Distance becomes a form of protection. You know, Siblings choose space because con- any kind of contact keeps triggering the same cycle of hurt feelings. Sibling estrangement usually begins with small fractures. It may be just sarcastic comments at every gathering, and over time, there's an emotional cost. You start preparing for the next hit. You may even rehearse what to say, or maybe avoid saying anything at all at a gathering. Many estrangements have a turning point, and that turning point is sometimes when one sibling clashes with the parents. Oftentimes, sibling estrangement literally explodes after the death of a parent when property is being distributed among the surviving children. You can imagine what happens when one of the children rushes in and seizes valuable property that might include household furnishings or equipment or livestock, telling the others that the parent wanted them, wanted them to have the property. And other children, you know, the other children might find themselves gaslighted, as we say, when they express their perception of the parents' wishes, meaning that they make it sound like that never happened. That never happened, even when it's remembered clearly. One of the most common causes of sibling estrangement is accumulated grievances. When one of the siblings repeatedly tries to take advantage of the other siblings or just tries to bully them. Radically different values can contribute to estrangement. Especially when one of the siblings is viewed by the others as being very greedy. And then, as I alluded to previously, inheritance disputes frequently set the stage for sibling estrangement. Now, look, family is supposed to be forever. Yeah, but as I said earlier, a variety of surveys demonstrated that some 27 million American adults are estranged from a sibling. Therefore, sibling estrangement is not rare. It's common. And most agree that there's not a single precipitating event. Most estrangements develop through an accumulation of grievances over many years. Psychologists tell us that sibling relationships are powerfully developed and shaped by family dynamics during childhood. Now, what this means is if a sibling is treated as the favorite, one who can do no wrong, whether real or perceived, it begins to create resentment that can intensify in adulthood. It's common for a sibling who felt that he or she were the favorite to completely not understand the others who felt overlooked, and the other siblings who bore more family burden, who frankly resent what it looks like to them to be sibling privilege. These childhood dynamics often intensify during major family events like parental illness and death and inheritance, which are particularly potent activators of long-standing sibling grievances. In fact, money and inheritance, they're among the most commonly cited causes of sibling estrangement. The distribution of property after the death of a parent involves financial implications, but it also sends symbolic messages about parental love and fairness. Research has consistently shown that inheritance conflicts are rarely solely about money. They're about siblings' childhood perceptions of fairness and favoritism that becomes validated by the final parental act. Sadly, there sometimes comes a time that cutting ties with the sibling you may be fighting with is the best path forward. Particularly if it's necessary to safeguard your own mental, physical, and emotional health. According to one psychologist who said this, when or how a person might know it's time to cut ties completely depends on the individual situation and comfort level. If there is persistent emotional manipulation, physical abuse, or other unhealthy or destructive behaviors that are causing harm, then it may be best to end the relationship. Toxic relationships also, they often include controlling behavior, gaslighting, sometimes physical violence and assault, emotional blackmail, and constant criticism or verbal abuse. It can also include siblings' efforts to steal or take things from a sibling. You don't need to have a sibling in your life forever just because you were raised with them. If they're not good for you emotionally, psychologically, or physically, it's better to have a chosen family with friends rather than a sibling relationship chosen for us, especially if nothing's going to change in that sibling dynamic. Think about this. If your brother or sister dies, everyone gives you support. But if you say you no longer see your brother or sister due to unresolved problems, I assure you the response is going to be different. Some people will judge you and think you should have worked harder on working it out. The point is, these things are very difficult. Sometimes siblings reach the conclusion that their differences can only be resolved in a court of law. It's not unusual to find this happening when inherited property is being disputed. The Bible has much to say on the subject of lawsuits. 1 Corinthians 6, 1 through 7 strongly discourages Christians from resolving disputes among the community of believers. Resolving disputes in a court, that is. The Bible generally discourages lawsuits because the Bible prioritizes peace and reconciliation over asserting personal rights. Romans 12:18 instructs, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And then we have Ephesians 4:3 that urges believers to make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. In Christianity, forgiveness is central, and Christians are called to let go of grudges and avoid actions that could harm relationships or our witness. And while lawsuits are discouraged among believers, the Bible also emphasizes justice and integrity. In Deuteronomy 16 and Exodus 20, you'll see instructions to judges to act impartially, not favoring the powerful, and to ensure fair treatment in disputes. The Bible is not opposed to utilizing the legal system. In Acts, in chapters 21 and 22, we can read about the Apostle Paul being arrested and wrongfully accused of a crime he did not commit. The Romans arrested him, and the commander brought Paul inside and ordered him to be lashed with whips to make him confess his crime. As they tied Paul down to lash him, Paul said to the officer standing there, "Is it legal for you to whip a Roman citizen who has not even been tried?" You see, Paul masterfully was using the Roman law and his citizenship to protect himself. Now, the point I'm trying to make is there's nothing wrong with using the court system as long as it's done with the right motive and a pure heart. In fact, a recent poll of evangelical leaders, 82% said that the Bible does not forbid Christians from suing each other. They agree that in the 21st century, even Christians are caught up in the complicated legalities of today, and they may have to settle disputes in the courtroom. Now, there's general agreement among Christian leaders that lawsuits, especially among siblings, should be a last resort, meaning all reasonable efforts to resolve the matter without litigation have been explored. We live in a complex world, and sometimes the judicial system is needed to sort out matters. It goes without saying that when Christians are engaged in a lawsuit, especially among siblings, we should embrace the highest principles of fairness and seek what is best for all. I think we all recognize as siblings that brothers and sisters have a bond unlike any other. They grow up together, share experiences, and influence each other's lives in ways that no one else can see. Sometimes they're best friends, and other times they can become the worst of enemies. No matter what, the Bible has a lot to say about sibling relationships. The very first siblings in the Bible were Cain and Abel. The story is found in Genesis 4, and it reveals both the power and the danger that exists in sibling relationships. Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam and Eve, and they each brought offerings to God. Abel's offering pleased God, and Cain's did not. And instead of handling his disappointment in a healthy way, Cain let jealousy take over. Genesis 4:8 says, Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were there in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Killed him. This was the first act of murder in the history of the world. And it occurred between two brothers. This story demonstrates how letting anger and jealousy and resentment go, how it can destroy lives. And at the very least, when we let negative emotions control us, they can destroy relationships and lead to regret. This is not what God wanted in sibling relationships. God created family to be a source of love and support, not division. Then we have the story of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers who had a complicated relationship from birth. Genesis 25:23 says, "The Lord said to Rebekah, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." You probably remember the story. Jacob tricked Esau out of his birthright and later stole his blessing. Esau was furious, and he planned to kill Jacob. Their relationship was broken for years because of deception and selfishness. But their story did not end in hatred. Years later, they met again, and Esau forgave Jacob. Genesis 33:4 says, "But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept." They wept. The story demonstrates that even when siblings hurt each other, forgiveness is possible. God can heal broken relationships and restore love where there was once bitterness. Forgiveness among siblings is graphically displayed in the story of Joseph and his brothers. If you remember, Joseph's brothers were jealous of him because their father Jacob favored him. Out of jealousy, they sold him into slavery and told their father that he was dead. Years later, after Joseph had risen to power in Egypt, his brothers stood before him, desperately needing help. Instead of revenge, Joseph forgave them. Genesis 50:20 says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Now, Joseph could have punished his brothers, but he chose mercy instead. The mystery of forgiveness is that it not only brings healing for the person who is forgiven, but also for the one who chooses to forgive. Holding on to anger only hurts us, but letting go brings peace. The Bible teaches that siblings should love each other deeply. Proverbs 17:17 says, "A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity." The verse is telling us that siblings are meant to support one another, especially in difficult times. Even when disagreements occur, love should remain. 1 John 4:20 challenges us with this tough question. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or a sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister, who they have seen, cannot love God, who they have not seen. So you see, if we say we love God, then we must also show love to our siblings. And this kind of love is patient and kind and willing to set aside pride. Did you know that Jesus had brothers and sisters? Mark 6:3 says, "Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" This verse makes it very clear that Jesus grew up in a family with siblings, just like us. And just like us, they didn't always get along. John 7:5 says, "For even his brothers did not believe him." It's true. His brothers did not believe. Jesus' brothers did not accept him as the Son of God. But later, some of his brothers became the strongest of believers. His brother James became a leader in the early church and even wrote the book of James. This demonstrates that family relationships can indeed change over time. Even if there's distance and misunderstanding that exists now, God can bring unity later. It's not uncommon for one sibling to be viewed by the others as someone who's not a genuine Christian, no matter what they profess. Even when there's distance from the other siblings, prayer, along with encouraging words and actions, can be a tremendous influence. The other siblings can truly be an influence on the one who is struggling in their faith. Jesus taught that the greatest among us would be those who serve others. Matthew 23:11 says, "The greatest among you will be your servant." The greatest among you will be your servant. We can apply this to sibling relationships. At the very least, it means showing kindness even when they don't deserve it. Sibling estrangement is not rare. And it seems to happen in families all around us. Hurt, betrayal, and a lack of relationship, these are the characteristics of estrangement. Sometimes no matter how much we try, things never seem to improve. Romans 12:18 gives this critical advice. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. This means doing your part to keep peace, even if the other person is not willing. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to tolerate toxic behavior, but it does mean keeping your heart free from hate. Pray for your sibling, even when they seem difficult to love. Ask God to soften their heart and to heal the relationship with other siblings. Even if change doesn't happen right away, we have to trust that God is working behind the scenes. Now, as this podcast begins to come to a close, I've been talking about sibling relationships, especially when estrangement occurs. Now, listen to this. Jesus said in Matthew 6:14-15, "For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins." Now, this is a serious warning. And God expects this to especially be true among the relationships of brothers and sisters. In Matthew 5:23-24, Jesus says this interesting thing. "Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar, and first be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift." This verse is telling us that when we are involved in worship and still carrying sins that are displeasing to God in the form of our relationship with a sibling, then God is telling us that we need to take care of that problem, because a continuous quarrel with a brother or sister gets in the way of communication with God. The bottom line is that God is asking us to forgive those who have wronged us and to make amends to those that we have wronged. I want to thank you for listening to this podcast today, and I hope you will join us again in the future. And I pray that you will become one of God's great peacemakers.